in Cairo. And he says, I relied on it since it was corrected by Ben Asher, and it was worked on and analyzed by him for many years, and was proofread many times in accordance with the Masorah, and I based myself on his manuscript in the Secretariat that I wrote. This is what the Rambam writes. So, which text does he refer to? Right? Anybody know?
The Aleppo Codex.
Right, what's the name of this text? We have it too.
The Aleppo Codex.
That's correct. The Aleppo Codex. That's correct. That's the Aleppo Codex. The Aleppo Codex. That's what that's Ram Sober.
Yes.
Kesser Ram Sober. That's what it refers to. So let's go into the details a little.
Do you know about does everybody know about the modern history of the Aleppo Codex?
Yes, Syrian Jews in Flatbush,
Right.
giving them their houses.
They're trying to sneak it out.
That's what I want to discuss right now.
Sorry.
So let's go into the details about the history of the Aleppo Codex. It has a very interesting history. It. Look at this right now.
What the two principal cities
In Syria
that Jews lived in? Damascus and Aleppo.
Right.
We'll translate again for the Arab.
There's the Damascus Codex also. But the Aleppo Codex is the most important and is the most authoritative Masoretic text that we have to this day. And okay, so let's discuss the history of the Aleppo Codex. It was written by Ben Asher himself. This is manuscript back then had a colophon, which is the last page indicated who wrote it, who edited it, and etc. And who sponsored it, of course. It's very expensive to write a text.
The ISBN number.
I will say for Zeh.
And so it indicated that it was written by a guy named Shlomo Ben Juaya, I think is his name. Back then they used to have a sofer and a nakdan. The scribe wasn't the same as the nakdan, the person who provided the vowels. So they had there's kind of a division of labor. They had a sofer and a nakdan. So the sofer was not even Ben Asher. The sofer was not even a Masorete, as far as we know, just a regular guy. And then he stepped in, Ben Asher stepped in, and he was the nakdan. He provided the vowels, he provided the Masorah. Masorah is textual notes on the margin of the text. And he also edited the actual text to conform with what he believed is the correct text. And in order to deduce that, he examined many different manuscripts, many different codices, or scrolls, and he tried to come up with what he considered reliable. I don't know what criteria he used to come up with the correct text, and he would literally erase or add letters. And the Rambam actually mentions these things in Sefer Yad. He mentions the word tola, and he mentions the word gore. Tola means you hang a letter into the text if you want to add, and gore means you scratch it off. And according to the Rambam, it seems that it's easier to scratch off than to add a hanging letter, and therefore, if a text has too many errors and you need to add too many letters or words, then it's possible, and you have to write a whole new text. But if you're deleting, then you can delete more words. It's not a problem because I guess aesthetically it's easier to read. It's not such a big problem deleting a letter than adding a letter. But what was I saying? Right. So the Aleppo Codex, right? So it was written originally. Yeah. So it was written by this Buaya. It was edited by Ben Asher. And Ben Asher lived, of course, in Tiberias, and so he edited it. Several years later, it was purchased by the Karaites. And this is again why we suspect that he may have been very closely related and probably one of the Karaites himself. So the Karaites of Jerusalem, they had a synagogue in Jerusalem, and they purchased or somehow acquired this manuscript, and they used it for them. So they had it until the First Crusade. During the First Crusade, about 1100 AD, when the Christians came in, they captured the text, and some Jews were also captured there. And so a letter was sent to the Egyptian Jews. The Egyptian Jews had a lot of money, and so they were asked to help redeem the text. And the Egyptian Jews complied, and they managed to redeem the text, and hence the text was transferred to Cairo. And so that's how the Rambam got access to it several decades later. And the Rambam, of course, copied his own Sefer Torah, like we just mentioned. He wrote his own Sefer Torah, and he copied it from the Ben Asher text. And so the Ben Asher text must have had some major prominence even at that point, and the Rambam thought of it. But he gave him stamp of approval for it. And the Rambam, of course, was the major authority back then. And so once he gave that approval to that codex, it was considered the most accurate text, and it was. Modern scholars agree actually with that it was very meticulously copied and very meticulously. A lot of the manuscripts back then didn't have, for example, a correspondence between the textual notes and the actual text. Sometimes you have a textual note that was mentioned. This word occurs 7 times in the Bible, but it's not there 7 times. It's only there 5 times. That's because, like I said, the Nakdam and the scribe were 2 different people. So
as many other writings of the Rambam were controversial, this never encountered any controversy.
No, there's no controversy about that because nobody knew, during the entire Middle Age period, nobody suspected that he might have been a Karaite. So the Rambam just gave his approval, and on the contrary, probably the reason why nobody suspected that he could be a Karaite, and nobody raised this issue, raised Cain, was probably because he gave his stamp of approval. So it was out of the question. He must have been a rabbinic Jew. He must have been kosher. Because the Rambam said that his text is good. And so let's continue. So this text ended up in Cairo. So it was there until 1375. In the year 1375, some of the descendants of the Maimonides, I don't know for what, 1375, they transferred it back to Aleppo. I don't know why they did so. The reason is not stated.
Sure.
But for some reason, they took it to Aleppo.
Beer bottle. Move it away.
The Berbers, what do they call them?
Yeah, that may have been a reason for the actual security of the text itself. That could be a reason. I don't know why, but for some reason, the descendants of the Maimonides transferred it to Aleppo, not that, but transferred to Aleppo, Syria. And in Aleppo, they had a very thriving Jewish community back then, and so it remained there, and in a vault or in some other cupboard in the basement chapel of the synagogue in Aleppo, and it was very zealously preserved, and nobody could have access to it unless authorized. And people from all over the Jewish world would send queries to the community in Aleppo, asking them to verify their text. Like they were asked, for example, how do you spell this and this word? And the Aleppo community would respond, this is how we have it. So yeah, it was good business, right? I'm sure they had to provide something in some consideration.
Self-addressed stamp of approval,
right.
at the very least.
Exactly. So but they were very, very protective of their text. They were so protective that even as late as the 19th century, they didn't allow any modern scholars to put an eye on it. And modern scholars were trying to photocopy it and preserve it, but they wouldn't let them look at it. I suspect maybe it's because the modern scholars were not very Jewish. They were Christian and they had a different agenda probably. They were probably a little suspicious about them. But I think part of the reason also was because they were just suspicious about the whole thing. They were very traditional and they thought that this text would protect them. They used to pray before it. They used to swear by it. They almost held it like a relic, like a sacred object. Yeah, that's true.
Imagine that.
And it was mentality. Exactly.
Don't worry. We'll be somewhere.
I don't want to say that.
Don't say that to the...
I'm not saying that.
It's Torah. Why was everyone surprised?
That's a party mentality.
They hold it as a sacred relic. Madonna's a
it wouldn't be typical of an Ashkenazi mentality to worship like an object like that.
Tachas Yorecha is funny. That they would hold the same.
There's a connection there to the Testament and the word for
But the Sephardim had this attitude, and unfortunately, because they were so protective, in 1947, the UN said, we're going to found the State of Israel. And so the Arabs said, oh no State of Israel in my midst. And so they said, no, we're going to riot. And so they came and they besieged the synagogue in Aleppo, and they set it on fire. And ever since then, the text disappeared. And nobody knew where it was until 1958. 10 years later, it was thought it was lost. Maybe it was lost in the fire, maybe it was burned, nobody knew. In 1958, the Israelis found out that somebody had it, and it was being preserved or hidden in Syria. And through the intermediacy of the president, Ben Zvi, who was the president of Israel back then, and he was of Sephardic origin, so he had this correspondence with the community in Syria. I think he was originally from Syria also.
You said Ben Zvi? Ben Zvi was not Sephardic.
He wasn't? I thought maybe he was Sephardic because he had this close connection with them. He was able to convince
his last name was Skolnick or something like that.
Sephardi didn't go into government until really, really late.
No, he was just the president.
The words he started
doesn't matter.
The words he started in government, but not that.
But anyway, he had this